Robert A. Durst in 2016. He is accused of shooting a friend, Susan Berman, in the back of the head in December 2000. Pool photo by Jae C. Hong, Los Angeles. The retired New York City police detective Michael Struk can still recall the afternoon Robert A. Durst walked into the 20th Precinct on Manhattan's Upper West Side to report that his wife had vanished. Mr. Durst, clutching his dog and a two-year-old magazine with his father's photograph on the cover, sat at the detective's desk and described how his wife, Kathy McCormick Durst, had vanished 4 days earlier, like he was in a deli ordering a sandwich, the detective said. Ms. Durst was never found and Mr. Durst was never charged in connection with her disappearance, but her fate is central to the case that John Lewin, a deputy district attorney in Los Angeles, is building against Mr. Durst for the murder of his confidant, Susan Berman, here in 2000. Mr. Lewin contends Mr. Durst, 74, the estranged son of a prominent New York real estate family, killed Ms. Berman to prevent her from disclosing to the authorities what she knew about his role in Ms. Durst's disappearance. Mr. Durst has denied killing either woman. This week, Mr. Struk, long since retired, testified in detail about his investigation and a conditional examination which can take place under California law when a witness is 65 or older and may not be available for trial. Over the past year, Mr. Lewin, the prosecutor, has brought in 17 witnesses who provided damaging testimony against Mr. Durst. But in a case riddled with surprising twists, it was Mr. Durst's defense lawyer, Dick DeGuerin, who called Mr. Struk as his first witness and argued that the detective had done a thorough job. Even Superior Court Judge Mark East Wyndham noted the interesting turn of events. Usually, he said, it is the defense saying that the prosecution failed to turn over every stone. Here, the shoe's on the other foot. Mr. Struk never formally named Mr. Durst as a suspect. If there was no reason to believe that Mr. Durst killed his wife, then the rationale for his current trial would be undermined. In a scorching cross-examination on Wednesday, Mr. Lewin cited one mistake or flaw after another in the investigation, in which he said Mr. Struk failed to search the Stone Cottage 50 miles north of Manhattan where the couple had last been together, despite quickly uncovering the lies behind Mr. Durst's alibi. DeGuerin called the witness to show that there was a great investigation. Mr. Lewin told the court, as Mr. Durst, looking feeble, listened, and I'm going to show you how there was no great investigation. Before Ms. Durst's disappearance, she and Mr. Durst had a dispute at their Stone Cottage in South Salem, NY, on January 31, 1982. Mr. Durst told the police that he had driven her to the train station. Ms. Durst, a medical student at Albert Einstein College of Medicine who was 5 months away from graduation, wanted to return to their Manhattan penthouse so that she could attend a clinic the next day, Mr. Durst told the police. The next day, a woman who identified herself as Kathleen Durst called Albert Cooperman, a dean at the medical school, to say that she was not feeling well and would not attend the clinic. Investigators now contend that Ms. Berman made the call to make it appear that Ms. Durst had made it to Manhattan. 5 days later, Mr. Durst told Mr. Struk that his wife was missing. Under questioning by Mr. DeGuerin on Tuesday, Mr. Struk described his investigation with references to his notebook, official police reports and handwritten chronology. Mr. Struk said, "We asked for extra manpower, as he and other police interviewed witnesses, including Mr. Cooperman and a doorman at the couple's apartment building, who claimed he took Ms. Durst up to the penthouse on Sunday night." Mr. Struk described for Mr. DeGuerin how a police artist worked with the doorman to develop a drawing of a man who, the doorman said, came to visit Ms. Durst that same night. In addition, Mr. DeGuerin asked the detective about how friends of the Dursts had disclosed that Ms. Durst, under pressure from a failed marriage and medical school, was using cocaine and missing classes at school. Frustrated by the detective's investigation, Ms. Durst's sister Mary McCormick Hughes and her friend Geraldine McInerney, as well as a second group of Ms. Durst's friends, conducted their own inquiry, searching the South Salem house and the couple's Manhattan apartments for clues. Mr. DeGuerin asked if the amateur sleuths had interfered with his investigation. But Mr. Struk responded that, "I knew Mary was under a lot of strain and duress. They would bombard me, all of us on the team, with a lot of their thoughts, suggestions in hopes that we could resolve this quickly." Mr. DeGuerin asked Mr. Struk if he was satisfied that he did his best to solve this mystery. "We did whatever we could with what we were presented with what direction we had," Mr. Struk responded. but I am professionally comfortable with what we had done before the case got really cold, to those who had excoriated his investigation for failing to lead to Mr. Durst's arrest. Mr. Struk was blunt in his testimony. What hard evidence? What crime scene? What dead body? The next day, under a cross-examination by Mr. Lewin, Mr. Struk said he had always been suspicious of Mr. Durst. He acknowledged that within hours of opening the investigation he had caught Mr. Durst in several significant lies. Mr. Durst initially told Mr. Struk that his marriage was in fine shape, but Ms. Durst's friends and family told him she lived in fear of her husband and recounted instances of violence, which were borne out in hospital records. Mr. Lewin also asked Mr. Struk why he had never asked Mr. Cooperman, the medical school dean, how well he knew Ms. Durst and whether he would have recognized her voice. Last February, Mr. Cooperman testified that he had spoken to Ms. Durst a total of 15 minutes over the course of her 4 years at the school. He said he had assumed that the woman who called him was Ms. Durst because that is how she identified herself. At one point, Mr. DeGuerin, the defense attorney, complained of Mr. Lewin's close questioning of Mr. Struk. The detective did what he did and he did a good job. Mr. Struk testified that Mr. Durst had told him that he had gone to his neighbor's house for a drink after dropping his wife off at the train station. That quickly proved to be a lie. In light of that, did you go immediately and have that South Salem house taken apart brick by brick? Mr. Lewin asked the detective. Looking back on that now, Mr. Struk responded, that probably would have been a good thing to do. Mr. Struk was expected to be back on the stand on Thursday, but court proceedings were delayed when Mr. Durst did not show up. Court officials said that Mr. Durst had fallen ill and had been briefly taken to the hospital. Mr. Struk is expected to take the stand at the end of the month. A version of this article appears in print on November 18, 2017, on page A17 of the New York edition with the headline Retired Detective Defends His Work in 35-Year-Old Durst Case.